Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're bringing back a guest we've had on the program before as we talked about how we are going to deal with a post-society in the book known as Afterburn, Society Beyond Fossil Fuels. He is a senior fellow and resident of the Post-Carbon Institute and is widely regarded as one of the world's foremost peak oil educators. He's also authored scores of essays and articles that have appeared in such journals as Nature, American Prospect, Public Policy Research, Quarterly Review, and The Ecologist. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Richard Heinberg. Richard, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Hi, Daniel. It's very good to be talking with you again.
Now, it was funny because as I was looking at this book, I was thinking about just a few months ago, here we were seeing, for instance, gas prices, at least in the Northwest anyway, I can't say too much about the rest of the nation, close to $2 and below. And they keep doing this every couple of years, then they jack it back up to where it was or maybe even a little bit higher before, and I kind of wonder what's going on here. I mean, they kind of give the illusion that, oh, hey, gas prices are going to go down, but then they end up going back up and all that. What are they doing there?
Well, this is the markets adjusting to a new situation in the oil industry, and that situation is basically spiraling costs of production. We've run out of the cheap, easy-to-produce oil that powered the 20th century. And if you look around at new production prospects, they're all in the forms of unconventional oil like the tar sands in Canada or the tight oil that's being produced by hydrofracturing in North Dakota or Texas. And all of that oil is very expensive to produce. So you have spiraling costs to the oil industry, and they really need oil prices in the range of $100 a barrel or higher to make that work. Meanwhile, you have an economy that's in the doldrums that can't really afford $100 a barrel oil. So you have lagging demand, not just in the U.S., but around the world. And the combination of new but expensive supplies and lagging demand has produced the result of volatile oil prices. And the range of volatility that we've seen is between $40 a barrel and about $110 a barrel, which is pretty wide range. And nobody knows where it's going to go next. It really depends on whether demand picks up, in which case we'll see soaring prices once more, or if the world's economies remain weak and demand remains soft, then what we'll see is continuing low prices. But that's going to be it's going to be hell for the oil industry, which is right now, basically in a retirement party. A lot of companies are basically winding up business, and I'm talking mostly about the smaller companies that specialize in the expensive-to-produce unconventional oils. They're losing money in the oil that they're actually producing. So it's as I said, a volatile situation. There's no longer a Goldilocks price that works for both producers and consumers. And so, as I said, nobody knows what's going to happen with prices going forward, but it's either going to be bad for society because prices will be too high, or it'll be very bad for the industry because prices are too low. And there's no Goldilocks price in between that works for everyone.
Well, I can't imagine that there would be, especially with something that seems to be slowly, fading out as far as a resource goes.
Right. Well, that's the central problem, and it's one that's everyone sort of takes for granted the fact that oil is a non-renewable resource that's subject to depletion. But in the mainstream news media and in the economic pages and financial pages of newspapers, Wall Street Journal, and so on, you never really see this discussed. I mean, it's not as though we're about to run out of oil. It's not going to happen for a long time. But as a depleting non-renewable resource, we've extracted it using the low-hanging fruit principle. We've gone after the cheapest, easiest to get stuff first and left the nasty, hard stuff for later. And clearly, it's later. We're only going after the really nasty, hard to get oils these days, and that inevitably has economic repercussions, and we're seeing those playing out across the globe, and yet nobody's connecting the dots.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what you're hearing a lot about, especially over the last few years, is that of fracking. Now, describe what that is for people who may not be familiar with it. Pretty ugly stuff there.
Right. Well, the basic technology of hydrofracturing has been around for a very long time. It's using high pressure water and chemicals and sand to blast apart rock to free up the oil or natural gas that's stuck in the rock and that wouldn't otherwise want to come out. Now, the reason we hear so much more about fracking these days is that because of high oil and gas prices a few years ago, companies had the incentive to apply this technology to a range of resources that they previously knew about. They knew this stuff existed, but they knew it would be too expensive to get the oil and gas out, so nobody bothered. But using hydrofracturing technology and horizontal drilling, it is possible to get oil and gas resources out of what are called tight reservoirs, and they're called tight because the rock has very low porosity. There's oil and or gas trapped in it, but if you just drilled a conventional vertical oil well, you get a little burst of production, but not nearly enough to offset the cost of drilling. But with hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling, it's possible to get more fuel out of the wellbore, but it's still a low-grade resource. And the problem is the rate of production from a newly drilled and fracked well tends to be very high at first, but it tends to drop off very quickly. Once the hydrofracturing is done, you've sort of let loose a puff of oil and gas that you can withdraw. And then after about a year, the rate of production from that well has already fallen by maybe 70%.
Wow.
So you've got to drill and drill and drill. And so these companies are, they've drilled something like 85,000 oil and gas wells in the last 7 years. Just an enormous number of wells, and they've got to keep that up in order to keep production up. If the rate of drilling starts to fall off, then the rate of production falls off, and we're seeing that happen right now. As a result of lower oil prices, the drillers have cut back on drilling by about 60%. There are about 60% fewer drilling rigs operating in the U.S. today than there were 10 months ago. And so production from North Dakota and Texas has leveled off, and reliably, predictably, it's going to start declining unless the rate of drilling picks up again. So this is a very short-term play. There are only so many places you can drill in these formations because they're subject to the law of diminishing returns. There are a few sweet spots in North Dakota and Texas, a few counties where they're good shale resources, and outside those counties, there's stuff in the ground, but it's not going to be profitable to get out until the oil prices are much, much higher than they are now. And those sweet spots are being drilled out very rapidly. So this is not something that's shale oil and gas is not something that's going to be around decades and decades from now. We will see sharply declining shale gas and tight oil production in the U.S. well before the end of this decade.
Mm-hmm. And it's, you take a look, you step back from all this, especially when it comes to the fracking situation, you realize how it impacts the environment, for instance.
Right.
And, you're beginning to also see sort of a battle going on where it seems though these companies are going and deciding to go into places they shouldn't be doing this in the first place, as though they're entitled to do this because they have the lobbyists, and it goes on, and it seems that we kind of lose our voice, especially when it comes to the land that surrounds us. But in fact, we have to realize as individuals, we're the reason that this continues to do this. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, well, we use oil and gas, all of us. I mean, our economy runs on it. So if we want to get off of oil and gas, we have to make other plans. We have to either find other energy sources to replace them or find ways to reduce our consumption of energy altogether. And quite frankly, I think we'll be doing both over the course of the next few decades. You mentioned the environmental impacts of fracking. And of course, there was just a report released by U.S. government in that regard, and it got spun all kinds of different ways, that there was no systemic impacts on water. That's what the industry, that's the sentence from the report the industry highlighted. And then on the other hand, you have the environmental groups highlighting the fact that they did, in fact, find lots of instances where water supplies were impacted. The report, unfortunately, did not discuss air quality, and there's lots of evidence that fracking operations influence air quality. But the thing is, because this is so important economically that we're getting these fuels, lots of folks in important positions have the incentive to overlook these environmental problems, including the EPA, which was under a lot of pressure to minimize or downplay the environmental impacts, because after all, the Obama administration has trumpeted and ballyhooed higher U.S. oil and gas production as a success story for the administration. And so in Texas, you have a situation where the environmental impacts of fracking have devastated communities, households, and so there have been a number of cities in Texas. Denton, Texas is a good example, where they've passed ordinances to prevent fracking within city limits or under certain circumstances and so on. And that angered the oil and gas industry, so they went to the Texas legislature, which is always happy to listen to the industry representatives, and they got the Texas legislature to pass a bill preventing local communities from ever doing anything to regulate fracking within their jurisdictions. So, this is if we're going to deal with these problems, we're going to have to deal not just with the technical issues of making fracking safe or finding other energy sources. There are all kinds of other issues that are implicated in this, economic issues and governance issues, democracy itself. All of these issues are sort of packed together around the questions of energy, where we get our energy from, and what our future energy mix looks like.
Mm-hmm. I like that you brought up the ideal that you see things on a local level, especially when it comes to trying to regulate an industry that, can have a pretty harsh impact on the environment. And so you hear a lot of, especially over the last 10 years, about globalization. That's the new economy. In other words, for instance, in America, for many decades, manufacturing was the one that sustained our economy, the production, and so that was also. I was just talking with somebody about this the other day. I said there was a time where you could have a high school education or less in America, that you could go in and get an entry-level job, and you could work your way into a position of middle income, which is something that you really can't do anymore, because a lot of those kind of jobs have went overseas. And, and it's funny when you hear the debate about this because you never hear the consumer, as we're called, ever taking responsibility for the fact that, well, you try to find the best value you can for the cheapest possible price. Right. Well, the way to be able to achieve that is you've got to move these things overseas where they can be produced cheaper so that you can have it at an affordable price. And so you see this interesting cycle going on. And then back to the ideal of globalization, is this a good thing? Well, now you're stretching, for instance, out to where you have to ship these things out to be produced, then ship them back in to be consumed. You can see the idiot kind of loop going on there. And, more getting back to local, and I think we're starting to see that more, especially when it comes to food production. We all don't want GMO foods. We want to be able to have fresh, local, sustainable, and all that kind of a thing. And you see the answer right in front of you, but we still seem to always look beyond the horizon out somewhere else and leave it up to everybody else to solve the problems that inherently we as consumers are really creating. And I always say that over and over in the program, look, you vote with your wallet. So. Right. And I know that you talk quite a bit about that in your book.
Yeah, well, globalization is it's a manifestation of the principle of economic efficiency. So if economic efficiency says you can grow corn cheaper in Iowa than any place else, well, then you should grow all of your corn in Iowa and don't grow anything in Iowa except corn, because that's the most economically efficient thing to do. The problem with that is that there are side effects. You damage economies all over the place because there were lots of farmers elsewhere, who were growing corn before, and now they have to find something else. And it creates a more brittle kind of economy, because if your corn crop in Iowa fails, then nobody has corn and Iowa has nothing. So there has to be a balance between resilience on one hand, an economy that is diversified and sufficiently localized so that there's a kind of healthy ecosystem of goods and services in all locales. And economic efficiency on the other side of the equation. There has to be a balance between resilience and economic efficiency. And what we've done over the past few decades, especially I'd say the last 3 to 4 decades, is push all the way to the far end of the scale toward economic efficiency. And in the process, we've damaged local economies. We've created horrific environmental impacts. We pride ourselves on having cleaned up the environment here in the United States to a substantial degree, but part of the way we've done that is to do all our manufacturing in China, and you look at China's environment, and it's basically gone to hell in the process of producing all the gizmos and doodads, geehaws for
I find it funny, too, when you talk about gizmos, and it was just a flash that came to me, when you see lines waiting around the Apple store for the new release of an iPhone.
Right.
And I can't help myself but say this, but, not trying to offend any listeners, but how stupid have we become?
Yeah.
And I really hate to say that, but when you have to make a big news production out of people waiting in line to buy the newest phone, don't you think something's a little off there?
Right. Well, the Apple is taking advantage of a strategy that really goes back to the 1930s, and that's the strategy of planned obsolescence. And planned obsolescence was developed as a strategy, partly to deal with one of the problems that led to the Great Depression, which was the problem of overproduction. We had so much cheap energy in the early 20th century that we could make stuff in larger quantities than people were accustomed to buying it. And so, that led to an overcapacity of production. And that wasn't really solved until World War II, when the government became the producer and consumer of last resort. And then after World War II, America went full bore into consumerism, developing the advertising industry, consumer credit, and planned obsolescence, so that we buy and use and throw away as much manufactured stuff as possible, as quickly as possible. This was a new way of life, and it was deliberately promoted by the National Association of Manufacturers and other organizations. And it seemed to work in that world of cheap energy and easy long-distance transportation, where we had lots of cheap motor oil and bunker oil for ships. But now in the 21st century, as the cost of production of oil increases, as we talked about earlier, a globalization is not a sensible strategy for the future. And you see that in the trailing off of economic growth here in the U.S. and around the world. The whole strategy of increasing economic efficiency, we're still trying to push that strategy with these big new global trade agreements that are being rushed through Congress. But is that what we need at this point in our history? Do we need more free trade? Do we need more globalization? Or have we gone too far already with those strategies? And should we really be backing off and relocalizing our economies and creating more of those local manufacturing jobs that you were talking about earlier?
Well, I could say one thing that's encouraging, and you take a look at this generation, as they like to call them, the millennials, and I think they have really tuned into what is happening. What I noticed, for instance, we'll take something real basic that's an American pastime that it seems England has decided to adopt, and that is that of the senior prom. Now, here's the fascinating thing. Back in my day when I was in high school, when I went to the prom, it was just me and my date. That's what you did. You jumped in the car, and it was just the two of you. Nowadays, what you see are large groups coupling together and actually riding buses to the restaurant that they're all going to eat at together, and then they take that very same bus and they go to the prom. You take a look at that, and you're looking at 30 or 40 couples that aren't driving cars individually. So you kind of see more of a pulling away of that old happy days sort of a way of enjoying something like a prom, to a point where they just don't seem to be buying into that much anymore. I mean, there was a time when I was a teenager, even though I was living at home, I could afford to buy a car. I could afford to put gas in it and drive where I wanted to go. I could afford the insurance on it, and I could had enough money left over to take my girlfriend out. This day and age, forget about it. You can't even on the minimum wage of today. This was between $3 and $4 an hour I was making then. Now it's $10 an hour, and a lot of these kids just can't afford something like that anymore.
Yeah, you can feel the zeitgeist changing.
Right.
For the millennials, the idea of owning their first car as a rite of passage, that's just not there anymore. 3-4 decades ago, that was the big deal. That was the sign that you'd made it as an adult. You got your first car. But today, not so much. It's not about owning things and how much stuff you have and having your first car. It's more about connections with other people, experiences. Of course, a lot of those connections are mediated by the gadgets we were talking about earlier, the iPhones and iPads and so on. But at least there's some sense that there's more to life than just owning more and more stuff. And that's a good thing. I think that's a sign that we're starting to learn something.
Now, there is something I wanted to talk about that you discuss in your book, and that is the cooperative Darwinian moment.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Well, society is going to be going through some interesting transformations this century in terms of its economy, its energy systems, and those will all have political repercussions. When societies in the past have gone through these kinds of transformations, they've always been extremely disruptive, and they've often resulted in dramatic changes in government, sometimes revolutions or wars. and very often, extreme economic dislocation. So, how are we going to make it through this bottleneck? One possibility is a kind of Darwinian struggle for survival, where we're engaged in a fight over the scraps of the 20th century. The remaining fossil fuels, the remaining mineral resources, and all the rest. But that's not the only possibility. When you look at nature and how evolution works and how organisms operate within nature, there certainly is competition, but there's also a tremendous amount of cooperation. And evolution works as much by cooperation as by the struggle for survival. Mm-hmm. So this could be an opportunity for us to learn even more cooperation than we've known in the past. And humanity, human beings, we're a very cooperative species already, but we're also capable of some pretty nasty competitive behavior. My concern is that we set ourselves up for more cooperation now by creating more cooperative institutions, so that as the changes emerge in our economy and throughout society, we have some basis for cooperative behavior. Right now, most of our economic institutions are highly competitive in nature. I'm talking about corporations, for-profit banks, and all the rest. They tend to be competitive and predatory, and if those are the only institutions we have lying around, I'm afraid the future is going to start to look kind of ugly as we go through this period of transformation. If we had more cooperative institutions, co-ops, cooperative banks, which are otherwise known as credit unions, we already have thousands upon thousands of co-ops in the United States, far more than most people realize. But those cooperative institutions, I think, need to become much more the norm rather than the exception. Right. And it could have lots of beneficial effects all through the economy and through society.
Well, I know that we on the program, I think it was just a few years ago, we were talking about a mesh society, and where a society actually becomes, as you say, cooperative, where we actually borrow each other's things, and you see evidence of that with Uber, which seems to be the big buzz in the news. Yeah. But what they do, makes a lot of sense. There's nothing worse in America than waiting for a cab or trying to hail a cab. Right. And now you have this service that you can pretty much punch an app, and somebody shows up in their own car and takes you where you want to go, and for a lot less money, it seems like. And cab companies don't like this very much. And what's funny about that is that we seem to be so slow here in America to adapt to the idea of public transportation and perhaps using cabs. And there was a guest I had on the program from England, and he was saying that was one thing he found really alarming is here in America, you could wait until you're dead for a cab, it seemed like, out in the middle of nowhere. But he says in England, they're everywhere. Right. And that they use a lot of public transportation, so they don't seem to have as much of an oil problem as we do.
Right. Well, scarcity is going to be one of the things we're going to have to deal with during the course of this century. We've gotten used to extracting resources from the earth at unsustainable rates, and if it's unsustainable, that means it can't go on forever. And forever in this case is not thousands of years in the future. We're talking about the next few decades. We have created unsustainable systems within society whose sell-by date is not that far in the future. So as we face increasing scarcity of energy and materials, again, one possibility for dealing with that is ruthless competition, but the other possibility is sharing. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing evidence of of what's being called the sharing economy all over the place. And you've already mentioned a couple. Right here in Santa Rosa, we have what's called the tool library. So rather than having to have your own complete tool set and lawnmower and weed whip and a complete set of every tool you could ever possibly need, but you only use each of them maybe once every couple of weeks at the most, and some tools you maybe use once every couple of years. Well, why not go to the tool library and check one out, and then you're not burdened with the ownership that requires maintenance and so on. And a whole community gets to use the same set of tools. It just makes a lot more sense.
It sure does. The other thing, too, is you were just talking about how wasteful we can become in production. And I actually worked for someone who was in machining, and you've seen the kind of waste that went on there, and I thought, wow, I just don't know if I could wake up with myself every day with a business like this. But now we're moving into an era where 3D printing is on the horizon, and it's actually in motion now. We've talked about this on the program a few times, and in fact, just recently I was watching a news broadcast where they were talking with astronauts that were up in the space shuttle, and the 3D printer was making a specific kind of wrench that they needed. Now, the neat thing about the 3D printer is the amount or the lack of waste as it produces something. For instance, a house. These things actually are beginning to be able to do this. Now, look at how many people it takes to build a house. Look at all the materials that are left over after the house is built, And then you take a look at something like a 3D printer, and there's almost zero waste. That's kind of encouraging when you think about production for individual things like that and the ideal of recycling.
Yeah, it's a technology that does have a lot of potential. There is some concern about the kinds of pollution that are generated by 3D printers, because sometimes the particles are nanoparticles or very small particles that get into the environment. Hopefully those kinds of problems can be solved, and if so, then 3D printing could be one of the a part of the tool set that helps us solve some of these problems, reduce our energy consumption, reduce our materials consumption and waste, and still meet our basic needs. I mean, that's the name of the game. That's the challenge that we have for the remainder of this century. Reduce materials and energy, and yet meet human needs.
I think what's really encouraging, you had mentioned about how life finds a way to become cooperative. You look at systems of symbiosis, and that's how it works. There's some give and there's some take. That's just how it is, but there's a balance in everything. And you feel kind of encouraged, here we're talking about 3D printing, building things that maybe we need on a local level, And then you take a look at, for instance, the financial industry and how that's changed, where you can now get micro loans from several people rather than bother from a bank that's just waiting to have you leveraged to the hilt so they can maybe get their money back or take whatever you have should you not be able to come through. And it's just really fascinating how all these old systems seem to be breaking down in their ways, and new systems are coming up in place which seem to be more empowering for individuals and communities. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, there are a lot of encouraging new projects and ideas around. Some of them have been, incubating for a few decades. For example, permaculture. It's a whole way of designing not just gardens but a whole way of life, so that it's self-regenerative. And you look back at where this came from. It started in the 70s with a couple of ecologists, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, who understood, that we would be in the 21st century facing the problems of energy and material shortages. And they said, well, what we have now with industrial agriculture and industrial production is inherently unsustainable. What can we design that's different, that again meets basic human needs with less materials and energy? And they came up with this system called permaculture. And now, it's growing like weeds. There are permaculture design courses in just about every city, and people are taking these classes, and it's changing their whole view about what's possible and what's smart to do, and changing behaviors, and that's just one example. But the cooperative movements we talked about earlier, and some changes in technologies. We do have falling prices for renewable energy technologies, solar and wind. So there are some great trends to focus on. Sometimes you can look at the news and see these old institutions, Wall Street and the national governments of the world, and it really looks like we're headed towards some kind of mass breakdown. And yet you turn around and you look at what's springing up from the grassroots, and it's really a whole different world that's taking shape.
What's interesting, I was just watching a documentary called Generation Like, which is about social media and the growth of how we're connecting and communicating with each other. And what was really fascinating in the documentary was how they were talking about, here was, a group of generation of kids that grew up being advertised to,
Right.
And nowadays, they're the very ones that are actually driving the messages.
Yeah.
And you look at how things have counterbalanced, and it's pretty fascinating to realize, you hit so clearly when you were talking about permaculture, people go out and they want to learn about this. They go to classrooms and they become educated. And, so the old ways of railing against the system, it's big brother, big government, it's this, that, so I got to scream and rail, it's all their fault that I'm miserable. And you're seeing they're finally starting to realize the three fingers that are pointing back at them, that, well, it's because of the decisions you've made that made these kind of things occur. And it's really encouraging. For instance, just yesterday, I believe it was, I was reading, and this may seem a little off track, but I don't think it is, Taco Bell is now eliminating all the additives and unnatural ingredients in their food. Taco Bell is.
Yeah.
And that you're seeing more companies that are sprouting up. For instance, I think it was Chipotle Grill was one of those that started doing the fresh and all that. And so you're seeing this more and more, and it's because we've all started making decisions. What is being put in our food? How can we change that so we feel healthier? Right. You also see that as well when it comes to medicine. People are becoming more educated about how to take care of themselves so they don't turn it over to a very broken system as the one we have in America. You just kind of wonder, what do you think politics is going to have to do? Because there's no way it can keep getting bigger and more controlling. It's just not possible as people start making more of these personal decisions, which may seem small to them in a large world full of problems, but that it starts rippling to a point that there wouldn't be a whole lot that these big institutions and corporations and government bodies can really do about it.
Yeah, right. I agree. You mentioned Chipotle, and one thing they did was to publicly make the decision to no longer buy genetic ingredients that were genetically modified. And that's, Chipotle is not a huge company. It's, as food chains go, it's
not compared to Taco Bell anyway.
Yeah, it's kind of medium size, but that has had huge implications for the whole food industry because since they've done that, the public attitude toward genetically modified organisms, GMOs, or genetically modified food has started to shift. And the big food giants like Monsanto have no real effective strategy for this.
Well, like I said, how could they? You walk away. What
can
they do
right.
about
I mean, do you take out billboards saying genetically modified food really is safe? I mean, because if you do that, then it just raises the question in people's minds. Why, methinks he doth protest too much. So it's there's no winning strategy for them.
Now, I know in the introduction of your book, you talk about the concept of the Great Burning. Tell us about that.
Well, this is something that we all kind of take for granted. It's amazing when you total it up, how much combustion is taking place on Earth's surface right now. Mm-hmm. We are burning the equivalent of a quarter of the Amazon rainforest every year. But of course, it's taking place out of sight and out of mind in internal combustion engines in our cars, in the furnaces that heat our houses, in factories that are making steel and cement and so on. And so it's easy to overlook or take for granted. But again, the sheer scale of combustion is absolutely unprecedented in all of Earth's history. In North America, the amount of combustion is roughly equal to burning. It's the amount of energy that is produced through combustion is about the same amount of energy that's taken up by all green plants on an annual basis. So all of the trees, all of the forests, all of the food crops, weeds, microscopic algae, everything, the amount of sunlight energy that's taken up by all of green nature in North America is about equaled by the amount of energy that's produced through combustion of ancient plant material in the form of fossil fuels. So this is the great burning. We are burning ancient sunlight at a prodigious rate, and that's what's creating climate change. Mm-hmm. And we somehow have come to think of this as normal because our economy depends on it, our lives depend on it, getting from place to place in our car depends on it, and yet this is something that is not only unprecedented but also completely unsustainable. And it's an idea that I'm hoping more and more people will just start to glom onto more or less subconsciously, so it spreads by osmosis, so that we stop taking it for granted and we realize that we are living in this extraordinary time. Because once you realize that, then you also realize we've got to do something about it. We've got to transition deliberately and quickly. Otherwise, we're going to face the consequences, and the consequences are not shaping up to be all that pleasant.
No, they're not. I know that when it comes to, one of the reasons I ask that question is a lot of times you see activists gather together and they're either trying to create awareness that something needs to change or they're trying to create that change themselves. And I remember as I was reading that in your book, Afterburn, I thought of the movie, I think it was Armageddon, starring Bruce Willis. Uh-huh. And they open up with that scene that he's on the big oil rig firing golf balls off of the deck toward a big tanker full of activists that are railing against him drilling for oil. So you know how much diesel fuel that thing eats up out there? What are you guys doing? But you think about the public relations problems that sometimes, activists have, especially when it comes to climate change. Is this really happening or isn't it? What's going on? It seems to be a weird argument. But what can they do about that as far as their public relations problem is concerned?
Yeah, well, it's a tough one, because if we're going to be honest about this, we're going to have to admit sooner or later that there will be some sacrifice involved in in mitigating climate change. It's not as though we're going to just shift all of our energy production from fossil fuels to solar and wind tomorrow and keep shopping. The rest of the economy will just keep humming along. We are facing a pretty profound change that's going to affect our daily lives, and certainly is going to impact the economy. The way, not just the way things are manufactured and the way energy is produced, but also how much stuff is produced and how much energy we have to work with. So that's a public relations problem of the first order. Everybody wants a happy story. Everybody wants to be told that there are good guys and bad guys. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, and we can win if we do this. And so, of course, the environmental movement has followed that script to a very large degree, saying, well, the fossil fuel people are the bad guys, we're the good guys, renewable energy is the good guys, and we can win, and all we have to do is build a lot of solar panels and wind turbines. Yeah, obviously we need to do that, but ultimately it's going to mean a lot more than just changing our energy sources, unplugging the coal plant and plugging in a solar panel. We have created unsustainable levels of consumption across the board. We're driving species extinct by the thousands on almost a daily basis with our land use practices and industrial agriculture. So a lot is going to have to change over the course of this century, and framing that in a way that is inviting and that paints a picture of a future that is different and yet satisfying. That is the public relations challenge of the environmental movement, and it's not a small one. It's not a trivial one. But I think we haven't found the sweet spot yet. I don't think we've engaged with the public yet, either honestly or creatively enough to get that message across.
Mm-hmm. I know even more importantly, too, Richard, is, as we talk about people who seem to be sounding the alarm about what the problem is, those are the bad guys.
Yeah.
Even in the realm of media that I work in, I see the same thing. You'll hear, oh, those greedy pharmaceutical companies, this is why I have poor health, or it's the same thing with the fuels. It's the same thing, with a lot of different things that are out there. And I always say on this program, I don't go after, those greedy pharmaceutical companies or those nasty banks, anything like that. I keep going back to the point, it's about you as an individual. What choices are you making? And how can you change those choices if there's something about that choice that causes that sort of problem that everybody's railing against?
Right.
And I think that's the key, is that it's basically becoming educated. For instance, learning about how to take care of your body or how to grow food or how to get from point A to point B with the least amount of energy effort. And that way, once you see choices, you'll probably make those choices more frequently. And again, you'll start seeing these things that you think have so much control over our lives, big government, big corporations, and you realize they don't have as much power as you think they do. And it's all because of your individual choice.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's there's a lot we can do with our individual choices, and there's a lot we can do with raising our voices about these issues, so that the larger institutions are forced to change over time. So, it's a combination, and the fossil fuel companies, are they really evil, or are they just giving us the stuff we need? That's an interesting conversation right there. As long as we demand the services that fossil fuels provide for us, then how can we paint the fossil fuel industry as somehow being evil? So, we have to get off the fossil fuels. So what does that demand of us? Well, it demands some creative thought and some behavior change. And as you say, that ultimately comes down to each of us. What kind of car we drive, how much we drive, do we use public transportation, do we demand public transportation from our elected leaders? These are all questions that really make the difference in the end.
And I think our listeners out there in reading Afterburn will realize there's not only a lot of questions that you'll start finding yourself asking, but also some direction as to how you can answer those questions as well. Always exciting to have you on the program. Always an impelling discussion, too, as well, Richard. It's always a pleasure to have you here on the program. Is there a website people can find out more?
Oh, well, gee. My
About 3 or 4 dozen of them, right? But it's better than billboards.
Well, I got 2, actually, that I'd like to direct people toward. One is just my website, richardheinberg.com. But the other is my organization, Post Carbon Institute, has a website called resilience.org. And it's my favorite website because it's updated daily with essays and news related to basically all the stuff we've been talking about in the last hour, Daniel. Mm-hmm. Everything from co-ops to renewable energy to permaculture and more. And I don't know of a single site on the internet that has a better mix of information on those topics.
Fascinating stuff. The book is Afterburn, Society Beyond Fossil Fuels. Our guest, Richard Heinberg. Richard, it's been a great pleasure to have you on the program, and one more time, those websites.
Okay, richardheinberg.com and resilience.org.
Resilience.org. I like the sound of that. Thanks again for being on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel. Take care.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Remember to get empowered, and one thing you could do is visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-news updates. You can also follow us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.